Okay, so you're standing there with a realtor and you're looking at a commercial piece of property there and you're thinking to yourself, I really like this piece of property. Price is good. Um, I'd be willing to go as high as 10% over the property price, what they're asking for. I'd really like to try to see if I can get 10% less. Should you ever tell a realtor that? Well, that just depends. All right, so everything here depends on your relationship with the realtor. So that is to say, are you a client of the realtor or are you simply a customer? And how do you know? All right, first, let me introduce myself. My name is James Stratton. I'm the senior realtor and analyst for OTG Realty Advisors. And we operate out of both the state of Florida and Texas. Now, today we're going to talk about Texas. Okay. We don't do any scripting here, and we also don't provide any legal advice. So if you signed any of these forms and you're really concerned about what your rights and responsibilities are, I highly recommend that you talk to an attorney so they can advise you correctly. All right, so let's move on a little bit on this. So remember, we're talking about the state of Texas, and Texas favors disclosure. And in Texas, they want you to disclose as soon as you can what your relationship is. And broker to broker, we have to talk about that, who we're representing and who we're not, because the type of roles that we have will determine what kind of information we can give and receive. All right. And all of this is designed to protect a client's rights and the same thing as a customer's rights. So the authority where you go find this in the statute is in the Texas Real Estate License Act, TRELA is what we refer to it as, and more specifically, Section 1101.558, and it's a representation disclosure, and it tells you who's required to disclose and what. And so one of the things we come all the way down here, and let's see if we make sure we get our requirements here. Okay. All right. We have to tell another party to the transaction, another license holder, who we represent and who we don't. And more specifically, it says right here, at the time of a license holder's first substantive communication with a party relating to a proposed transaction regarding a specific real property, the license holder shall provide to the party a written notice in at least 10-point font that describes the ways in which the broker could represent a party to a real estate transaction, including intermediary, and we'll discuss that here in a second, describes the basic duties and obligations a broker has to a party to a real estate transaction that a broker represents, and provides the name, license number, and contact information for the license holder and the license holder supervisor and broker if applicable. Okay, so then it also talks about what you're not required to do. All right, and so you're not required to give this notice in the case of a proposed transaction is for a lease that's less than 1 year and a sale is not being considered, meaning you're not doing a lease to own. Okay. The license holder meets a party with a license holder who knows is being represented by a license holder, or that the communication occurs at a property that is held open for any prospect buyer or tenant, and the communication concerns the property, and that would be like an open house. Okay. So let's go over to the actual form, and that'll tell us a lot here. So this is the form that a broker or a licensee is required to give you on that first substantive communication. And it tells you, it's called an information about brokerage services form. And it tells you what the responsibilities are of the broker and the sales agent. And we're going to get into some things here that cover our opening question. All right, so here we go. So a broker is responsible for all brokerage activities, including the acts performed by sales agents sponsored by the broker. That means any agent working under that broker is ultimately responsible for. So a sales agent must be sponsored by a broker and works with clients on behalf of that broker. So a sales agent can't act independently of his broker. He is simply works underneath the broker and is an extension of the broker. So in essence, when you're talking to the sales agent, you're talking to the broker. All right. I got to remember to talk up here in the camera, guys. Sorry, we don't script anything around here. So here it is. Um, so what is the minimum requirements that a broker has to do? Okay, so it says here, a broker's minimum duty requires by law A client is the person or a party that the broker represents. So now we're getting our first look at what a client is, okay? A broker must put the interest of the client above all others, including the broker's own interest, which means that if he's trying to hold out uh, commissions for higher commissions, he's not acting in the necessarily acting in the best interest of the client. So everything that the client or that the broker does, he must do in the interest of his. I'm sorry, everything that the broker does, he must do in the best interest of the client. Okay. Must inform the client of any material information about the property or transaction received by the broker. So that means anytime the broker hears some information, he has to go running right back to the client and tell the client what they found. Answer the client's questions and present an offer to or counter offer from the client, which means they can't just pocket hold offer. So if an offer comes in, the broker has to present all the offers unless you as a client have expressly told them, no, don't bring me offers of this type. Now, that's a whole different question. We'll talk about that later. Must treat all parties to the real estate transaction honestly and fairly. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that if, let's say, for example, you have there's a problem with a property, but you as an owner say, well, I really don't want to disclose that because I'm afraid it may lower the cost of my or the asking price of my property. It might make it look worth less. The broker is responsible for telling you that's not proper, that you have to disclose that. Further, the broker, without overcoming, not without being disobedient to you, must also inform the other parties that, and they usually do things like this. You might want to get an inspection, and that satisfies that proper problem. And that's just one example. Okay. A license holder can represent a party in a real estate transaction, which means a non-licensed holder can't, right? Make sense of that, right? So you have to be a licensed person, licensed agent in the state of Texas, or a licensed broker to represent another party in real estate. Okay, so here we get in the first definition as an agent for the owner, a seller's broker, okay, or a landlord's broker. The broker becomes the property owner's agent through an agreement with the owner, usually in writing, listing to sell or property management agreement. An owner's agent must perform the broker's minimum duties above and must inform the owner of any material information about the property or transaction known by the agent, including information disclosed to the agent or sub-agent by the buyer or the buyer's agent. That is your first clue. Here's what this is basically saying is that if you are a customer of the broker, which means that broker doesn't represent you, but they represent the seller. When you bring them a piece of information, like we discussed earlier, that, well, let's try to get a little bit less for the property, but I'd be willing to go 10% more. The seller's agent is responsible for telling the seller this information. It's required to do so. Can't withhold it. Okay. All right. As an agent for the buyer or tenant. Oh, hey, wait a minute. You as a buyer can actually have representation. Absolutely. Everybody in the transaction gets a right to a representation. And the benefit to that is you get the experience of the broker helping you in that transaction. Okay. All right. The broker becomes the buyer or tenant's agent by agreeing to represent the buyer, usually through a written representation agreement. A buyer's agent must perform the broker's minimum duties above and must inform the buyer of any material information about the property or transaction known by the agent, including information disclosed to the agent by the seller or the seller's agent. So let's say, for instance, the seller's broker, accidentally messes up and tells you something that they really didn't want you to know. Well, the seller's broker can't go say, "Hey, backsies." No, it's known. So now, as a buyer's agent, I'm required to go to my buyer and tell them what I've learned. Buyer's now my client, right? So I have to tell him that. So if he accidentally says, "Hey, my broker or my client will take 10% less," I mean, they're asking that. First of all, bad on the seller's broker. Shouldn't be doing that. But my responsibility is to my client if I am a buyer's agent. And by the way, let me back up for a second. At OTG Realty Advisors, we only represent buyers and investors and tenants. So we're never on the seller side of the equation. That's the reason why I kind of talk about that side a little bit more. All right. So as an agent for both, as an intermediary, so it's illegal in every state in the union to be a dual agent, which means you represent both sides. Can't, because how do you represent them and give them quality advice? You're working against one of them, right? So in the state of Texas, we have a term called intermediary service, which allows a broker to somewhat do that. Okay. So to act as an intermediary between the parties, the broker must first obtain the written agreement of each party to the transaction. Okay. The written agreement must state who will pay the broker, and in a conspicuous bold or underlined print, set forth the broker's obligations as an intermediary. A broker who acts as an intermediary must treat all parties to the transaction impartially and fairly. That's a definition of a customer. Okay. May, with the party's written consent, appoint a different license holder associated with the broker to each party, owner and buyer, to communicate with, provide opinions and advice to, and to carry out the instructions of each party to the transaction. Must not, unless specifically authorized in writing to do so by the party, disclose the owner will accept a price less than the written asking price, remember what I said earlier, that the buyer tenant will pay a price greater than the price submitted in written offers, which we talked about early in the very first opening question. Any confidential information or any other information that a party specifically instructs the broker in writing not to disclose unless required to do so by law. In essence, the intermediary does not provide the same level of service to both parties. They can't. There's no way. So it's always good to actually have your own broker, but in cases where you're comfortable with that, that's fine. And as long as you signed away and said in writing that you don't mind that, then the broker can actually do that. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's look over here as a sub-agent. What's a sub-agent? That's kind of an interesting character and a unique kind of to the state of Texas. I also represent, I have a broker's license in Florida, and that term doesn't exist. Okay, so here we go. As a sub-agent, a license holder acts as a sub-agent when aiding a buyer in a transaction without an agreement to represent the buyer. What does that mean? Okay, so that means they don't have a buyer's representation agreement with the person they're representing. They don't represent anybody. They've got a customer. That goes back to that customer again. A sub-agent can assist the buyer, but does not represent the buyer and must place the interest of the owner first. And why is that said? Well, in the state of Texas, there's well-established case law on this, that a seller's agent can expect that the sub-agent, in essence, works with them and is cooperating with them. Why is this important? Because the sub-agent needs to be free to be able, I'm sorry, the listing broker needs to be free to be able to speak with the sub-agent about confidential matters, including pricing strategies or negotiation strategies, without fear of you running to the buyer and telling the buyer what you just told them. Because now, if you're a sub-agent of the listing agent, then your buyer that you bring to the table is merely a customer and is not obliged or obligated to receive that information. Okay. Furthermore, a sub-agent is not an agent of the broker, meaning they don't work under the broker. They work in another brokerage. And this is fairly common. Actually, you get cooperating brokers who will come along and they'll agree to work with each other. I've got a customer. I really don't, I like what the terms are that you're offering for a commission, and I'll just get a commission from you. That's one way of doing it. Okay. So the next step is to avoid disputes. All agreements between you and a broker should be in writing and clearly established. The broker's duties and responsibilities to you and your obligations to the representation agreement. That also means that you as a client have obligations and you have to keep up with them. Who will pay the broker for service provided to you? when payment will be made, and how the payment will be calculated. You're going to find that in the representation agreement. And there's all different kinds of ways of being compensated as a broker. So that's a whole different video, and we'll go into that later. So now underneath it, it gives all this contact information about who's who do you contact, and what the form is, and how to get in touch with things, and all that good information, all that contact information. All right, so if you were able to hold with me, as we went a little bit longer than I wanted to go in this video, but if you were able to hold with me, I appreciate that. Leave your comments below, and I'd love to hear back from you. If you have any questions, just let me know. Thank you, and have a great day.